She was just a waitress clearing tables when she overheard the conversation. The Russian encryption was wrong. Amateur mistakes. She laughed softly and corrected it without thinking. What she didn't know: the man in the expensive suit was a mafia boss who trusted no one. Built his empire on secrets. And she'd just become the only person he couldn't let walk away. The crystal chandeliers in Rosso's cast, a warm amber glow over each immaculate white tablecloth. The room was elegant yet intimate, like a family gathering dressed in luxury. Nathaniel Rourke, known simply as Nate, sat quietly at a corner table, adjusting his tie, his eyes drifting across a menu he had memorized more than 10 years earlier, back when this place was nothing more than a dream scribbled on a napkin. Now, Rosso's belonged to him, along with nearly half the buildings in Chicago's Loop. The ossobuco tonight is excellent. Sire? A soft female voice said beside him. Nate didn't look up. Waiters came and went. He rarely noticed them. His gaze stayed fixed on the two men across from him, the Petrov brothers. Arms dealers posing as high-end textile merchants. Just water. I'm waiting for someone, he said curtly. The waitress nodded and walked away. Nate brushed his fingertip over his ear, activating a microcomms device. A voice spoke in Russian through the earpiece. Alpha team in position. Target approaching from the north entrance. He made no sign of hearing it. Neither did his 3 associates, one a young couple clinking glasses of wine. Another, an older businessman lost behind a newspaper. All of them were armed. All tuned to the same encrypted frequency. Copy. Nate replied in Russian, disguising it behind a small cough. Maintain visual protocol. The Petrovs were punctual proof of professionalism. Or fear. Nate rose to shake hands, his smile polite enough to disarm, precise enough to measure. Dmitri, the elder, was large and broad-shouldered, the kind of man who had once fought for money. Alexei, the younger, was lean, sharp-eyed, the kind of hunger that existed in both body and soul. Please. Sit, Nate said, listening as they ordered their meals. He never ordered during business meetings. You're interested in our shipment? Dmitri asked, his English thick with Moscow gravel. Very, Nate answered softly. Especially the one arriving Tuesday. That was the real deal. 30 kilograms of unregistered weapons hidden inside containers of silk. Nate didn't need the weapons. What he needed was a name who else was after them. 3 rival families had been circling, and Nate intended to find out which one. Another voice came through his earpiece movement in the kitchen. One female subject. Non-threatening. Nate barely nodded. The kitchen staff had been vetted thoroughly. A little noise was nothing. Prices as agreed. Alexei interjected, his eyes betraying greed. Dépend en quality. Nate replied. I'll need to verify before his words were cut short by a sudden transmission. Delta unit confirming encryption on channel 7. The speaker continued in Russian, fast and clipped. Behind him, someone laughed, a soft, lilting laugh, almost melodic. It should have dissolved into the background hum of cutlery and murmurs. But Nate heard it clearly. More importantly, he heard what followed. They used the wrong cipher term. Amateur. A woman's voice. Quiet and teasing. She was speaking to someone else. Perhaps another waitress. It's podtверджение. Not potverdit. Like saying confirmation instead of to confirm. Completely different protocols. Nate's hand froze midway to the glass of water. His heartbeat, rarely above 60, even in a firefight, suddenly quickened. No one outside his inner circle knew he used Russian code. No one. It was the only language he trusted. The number of people in Chicago's underworld fluent in Russian military encryption was vanishingly small. Yet somewhere behind him, a waitress had just corrected his team's syntax and explained the grammatical nuance as though teaching an introductory language class. Mr. Russo. Dimitri's voice pulled him back. His alias for the night, Vincent Russo. Independent investor. Is something wrong? No. Nate replied evenly, though his mind was roaring. Please. Go on. But he no longer heard a thing. His thoughts raced. Was she a federal agent? Impossible FBI agents didn't expose themselves over a linguistic slip. A rival spy, maybe. But far too clumsy. Coincidence. A waitress fluent in Russian military code. Working at the most exclusive restaurant in Chicago, a place that required reservations weeks in advance, he tapped twice on his earpiece. Switching to the emergency channel. The team would now rotate through backup frequencies. Standard procedure when a security breach was suspected. We can deliver a sample. Alexei said, tomorrow night. At the warehouse, then another voice came through. This time in English. The female staff member who spoke Russian. Shall we detain her for questioning? Nate's jaw tightened. Instinct screamed keep her. Anyone who understood his encryption system was either a priceless asset or a lethal threat. But this was Rosso's his own restaurant. Holding an employee would draw attention. The Petrovs would flee. The deal would collapse. And what unsettled him most was not the risk, but her tone when she said amateurs. There was no fear. No calculation. Only mild amusement. Like someone correcting a stranger's mispronunciation of the word croissant. No. Nate whispered. Just observe. But deep down, he knew the game had shifted, and the woman who had laughed behind him was a card he had never meant to play. Her name was Emma Callahan, 29 years old, part-time waitress at Rosso's. Evening shifts. Monday through Saturday, graduate of Northwestern University. Majoring in applied linguistics. Fluent in 5 languages: English, Russian, Italian, Chinese, and Spanish. Once a full scholarship student for all 4 years of college. Once an applicant to the United States Foreign Service Program. And once rejected. For a single line in her family record, Daniel Callahan. Her brother. Deceased. Emma's file glowed on Nate's tablet screen at 11:04 that night as he sat in his car. Parked 3 blocks from Rosso's. The first image that appeared was her graduation photo, brown hair tied neatly back. Gray eyes sharp yet carrying a hint of fragility. Not the look of a typical waitress. Nate zoomed in on the report excerpt. After Danny Callahan was murdered during a failed deal with the Russian Mafia, a $30,000 debt was transferred to his younger sister. Emma sold everything. Quit her office job. And took night shifts just to pay it off piece by piece. Since Danny's death, she had lived alone, no close friends, no relationships, almost invisible. But now Nate had seen her, and he couldn't look away. Emma didn't know she was being watched. She was washing her hands in the staff restroom, her fingers trembling slightly. Tonight, she had slipped. An old habit correcting anyone who misused Russian had betrayed the anonymity she'd guarded for 3 years. She should have stayed silent, but the misuse was unbearable. Like someone saying New Yuck instead of New York. She laughed, unthinking, and now it was too late. Danny used to say, smart people don't survive in this world, only the ones who know when to stay quiet. He died because he didn't. Beaten and left in an alley in Southside for listening where he shouldn't have. Emma had wept dry at his funeral. She blamed no one but herself. She had begged him to walk away from the Yakovich syndicate. Pleaded for him to stop. But Danny had said, we need the money. He'd wanted to protect her. And he'd died for it, leaving behind his debt. And a few strange men who still knocked on her door from time to time to remind her of her obligations. Nate reached the last page of the report and paused. Remaining balance. $18,000. Paid gradually over 3 years. Nearly every dollar she earned in tips. The Yakovich still hovered. Nate pressed the call button. On the other end, Marco, his head of security. Watch her. Don't approach. Don't let her feel threatened. I want everything her schedule. Her route home. The frequency of those visits. Marco nodded, understanding without question. When Nate hung up, he still couldn't look away from Emma's picture. Part of him still wondered, was she a plant, an undercover operative, or just a woman with big dreams now living on spare change and silence? Whatever she wasn't ordinary. And in Nate's world, the extraordinary were either dangerous or invaluable. At 11:47 that night, Nate remained in his car. The restaurant lights had gone dark. Employees filtered out one by one. Emma emerged last, wearing an old coat, a thin backpack slung over one shoulder. Her steps steady toward the bus stop. She didn't look around. But Nate saw everything, the subtle glance at the corner, the cautious step back when a strange car passed too close, the way she held her keys between her fingers like a blade, not out of fear but out of instinct. She wasn't fragile. She'd learned how to survive. His phone buzzed again. Marco. Got more. Boss. She studied Russian since 16. Specialized high school. Wrote her senior thesis on Cold War linguistics. Also worked briefly as a teaching assistant for the CIA summer language program, cut from the candidate list for family background. Nate closed his eyes for a few seconds. It all fit. She wasn't hunting him. She was someone who'd accidentally heard what she shouldn't have. And now he had to decide, erase her. Or claim her before someone else did. Meanwhile, Emma sat alone on the bus, her gray eyes fixed on the fogged window. She didn't know the man whose Russian she'd corrected tonight was watching her every move. Yet she sensed something shifting, an unusual stillness in the night, a current of cold air sneaking through her coat. Her heart, accustomed to endurance, beat faster. Not out of fear, but intuition, as if someone had just opened a door she never believed still existed in her life. The next morning, Emma arrived at Rosso's 15 minutes early. As always, a small ritual of control in a life where so much lay beyond her reach. The kitchen was still cold. The dining hall empty. She went straight to the staff area. Hung her coat, tied her hair into a neat bun. Her eyes caught the schedule board. Her name was circled. Beside it, a note in blue ink. See manager before shift. Room 3. Herr Polse skipped. She'd never been called in alone before. Emma knocked. No reply. She pushed the door open slightly. The lights were on. Inside, a man stood facing the window. Sleeves rolled up. A dark gray shirt molding to his frame. Familiar posture. When he turned, she recognized him instantly. The man from last night, the one at the VIP table. The one whose gaze had cut through her like a blade when their eyes met. "Good morning," she said, steadying her voice. "Are you the new manager?" He didn't answer immediately. He just studied her for a long moment, as if deciding where to begin. Finally, he nodded once and gestured to a chair. "Sit down. I'm not here to fire you." Emma didn't move. "I don't think I did anything wrong," she said, her voice calm, her eyes unwavering. "Do you know who I am?" he asked. She was silent for a moment, then nodded slightly. No name, but instinct, and she was smart enough to piece it together. This man wasn't a manager, not a regular guest, someone she should stay far away from. But for some reason, he was standing here. "My name is Nate Rourke. You can call me Nate. I own this restaurant and a few other things." She said nothing. The information wasn't surprising. He didn't wait for a reaction. "I heard part of what happened last night. You knew Russian encryption. You corrected the syntax. No one outside my team should have understood it. Yet you did. You caught me off guard. And that doesn't happen often." She swallowed. "If you're trying to threaten me, there's no need to dance around it." "I'm not threatening you," he said quietly. "I'm offering you something." Nate opened his briefcase, pulled out an envelope inside. A stack of cash, 2 forged IDs, and an unregistered phone. "I need someone like you. Someone who listens, who understands, who analyzes. Invisible, unnoticed. You work here. You hear more than you speak. I want you to help me find who's betraying me. Emma let out a soft, incredulous laugh. I'm a waitress, not a spy. Nate studied hair. No. You're the woman who knows to say podverzhdeny instead of podverdit. The one who once applied to the diplomatic corps. The only person in the room last night my men didn't even realize was listening. So no, you're not a spy. But you could become the best one I've ever seen. No. Not murmured. Just observe. But deep down, he knew the game had changed. And the woman who had laughed behind him was a piece he had never seen coming. Her name was Emma Callahan, 29 years old, part-time waitress at Rosso's. Working the evening shift Monday through Saturday. Graduate of Northwestern University. Majoring in applied linguistics. Fluent in 5 languages: English, Russian, Italian, Chinese, and Spanish. A full scholarship student for 4 years. Once an applicant to the U.S. Foreign Service Program. Rejected for a single line in her family file: Daniel Callahan. Her brother, deceased, at 11:04 that night. Nate sat in his car 3 blocks from Rosso's. The glow of his tablet lighting his face. Emma's record filled the screen. The first image, a graduation photo, brown hair neatly tied back. Gray eyes sharp but carrying something fragile. Not the look of a waitress. Nate enlarged the text. After Danny Callahan was killed in a failed deal with the Russian Mafia, a debt of $30,000 passed to his sister. She sold everything, quit her office job, and took night shifts to pay it off bit by bit. Since Danny's death, she'd lived alone, no friends, no relationships, almost invisible. But now, Nate had seen her, and he couldn't unsee her. Emma didn't know she was being watched. She stood at the sink, hands trembling slightly. Tonight she had slipped. An old reflex, correcting bad Russian, had betrayed the quiet anonymity she'd guarded for 3 years. She should have stayed silent, but the mistake was unbearable. Like hearing someone call New York New Yuck. She'd laughed, without thinking. Now it was too late. Danny used to tell her, smart people don't survive here. Only the ones who know when to shut up. He died because he couldn't. Beaten and left in a South Side alley for listening where he shouldn't. Emma had wept herself dry at his funeral. She blamed no one but herself. She'd begged him to leave the Yakovich men, pleaded for him to stop. But Danny had said, we need the money. He'd wanted to protect her, and he'd died for it. Leaving behind debt and men who still knocked on her door from time to time to remind her of her duty. Nate reached the end of the file and froze. Balance remaining $18,000 paid down slowly over 3 years. Nearly every tip she made. Yakovich still shadowed her. Nate called Marco, his head of security. Follow her. Don't approach. Don't let her feel threatened. I want everything from her shift schedule to how often Yakovich's men show up. Marco understood. When Nate hung up, his eyes stayed on Emma's photo. Part of him wondered, was she a plant, an undercover, or just a woman with big dreams now, surviving on pocket change and silence, whatever she was. She wasn't ordinary. And in Nate's world, the ones who weren't ordinary were either dangerous or useful. At 11:47, he was still in the car. The restaurant lights were out. Staff trickled home. Emma appeared last, wearing an old coat, a thin backpack, walking toward the bus stop. She didn't look around. But Nate noticed everything, the quick glance at the corner, the small step back when a car brushed too close, her keys poised between her fingers like a blade. Not fear habit. She wasn't weak. She'd learned how to survive. The phone buzzed again. Marco's voice found more. Boss. She studied Russian from 16. Specialized high school. Thesis on Cold War linguistics. Taught one summer at the CIA language program. Cut for family background. Nate closed his eyes for a moment. It all fit. She wasn't hunting him. She was someone who had accidentally heard what she shouldn't. Now he had to choose erase her. Or reach her first. Meanwhile, Emma sat alone on the bus. Gray eyes fixed on the fogged window. She didn't know that the man whose Russian she'd corrected was watching her every move. Yet, she felt it something shifting. A strange quiet in the night. A breath of cold through her coat. Her heart, long used to endurance, beat faster. Not fear intuition. As if someone had opened a door she hadn't known, still existed. Morning came. Emma arrived 15 minutes early. As always, a way to control the few things she could. The kitchen was cold. The dining room empty. She hung her coat, tied her hair into a bun. Her eyes caught the schedule board. Her name was circled. Beside it, a note in blue ink. See manager before shift. Room 3. Herr Puls skipped. She'd never been called in alone. She knocked. Silence. The door creaked open. Lights on. A man stood with his back to her. Sleeves rolled. Dark gray shirt. Gaze on the narrow window. Familiar build. When he turned, she recognized him instantly, the man from last night. From the VIP table, whose stare had cut through her like glass. "Good morning," she said, keeping her voice steady. "Are you the new manager?" He didn't answer right away. Just watched her for a long moment, deciding where to begin. Then he nodded and gestured to the chair. "Sit. I'm not here to fire you." Emma didn't move. "I don't think I've done anything wrong. Do you know who I am?" She hesitated, then nodded slightly. No name, but instinct. He wasn't a manager, not a regular guest, someone she should avoid. Yet he was here. "My name's Nate Rourke. You can call me Nate. I own this restaurant and a few other things." She said nothing. It wasn't news. It continued. "Calm. I heard part of what happened last night. You understood Russian code. You corrected it. No one outside my team should have caught that. But you did. You threw me off balance. That doesn't happen often." She swallowed. "If you're trying to threaten me, skip the dance. I'm not threatening you," Nate said quietly. "I'm offering you something." He opened a briefcase, drew out an envelope cash, 2 forged IDs, an unregistered phone. "I need someone like you. Someone who listens, understands, analyzes, invisible, unnoticed. You work here. You hear more than you speak. Help me find who's betraying me." Emma gave a short, disbelieving laugh. "I'm a waitress, not a spy." Nate studied her. "No. You're the woman who knows to say podverzhdeny instead of podverdit. The one who once applied to the diplomatic corps. The only person in the room last night my men didn't even realize was listening. So no. You're not a spy, but you could become the best one I've ever met." He was tall and lean, his hair silver, his gaze cutting clean through anyone it fell upon. Emma didn't dare stand too close. Yet, even from where she was, she caught the word repeated twice in Old Russian zakladka, harmless at first sound. But in the coded language of the underworld, it meant only one thing, an explosive device. A trigger, pretending to check the air conditioner in the corner. She tapped her phone as though sending a message. Her ears sharpened to every tone. She couldn't record the conversation clearly. The background noise was too loud, but she caught 2 things. A number, 3rd floor, and a name. Petrov. Her hand trembled as she typed a short coded message to Nate. Possible bomb. 3rd floor. Linked to Petrov. Mate in 10 minutes. Back corridor. She sent it and turned quickly toward the emergency stairwell. A minute later, Nate arrived. He didn't ask questions. just signaled for Marco to follow her into the technical room. Emma repeated every word she'd heard. When she mentioned Zakladka, Nate's face hardened. Petrov was scheduled to speak on the 3rd floor in 10 minutes. If a device had already been planted, this was no longer a power play, it was an act of war. Nate pulled out his phone, made a secure encrypted call. Within 6 minutes, his entire security team was in motion, spreading out to their pre-assigned positions. Emma and Marco went to the 3rd floor, posing as sound technicians. Meanwhile, Alex remained downstairs in the reception area, chatting easily, as if he had never left. From the balcony, Emma looked down and saw him raise a glass with a state senator from Illinois. His smile calm, practiced. Her hand tightened on the cold railing. If what she'd overheard was true, Alex wasn't just a traitor. He was prepared to kill not only his enemies, but the very men who once called him friend. If they didn't stop it tonight, blood would spill amid the glitter of chandeliers and applause. Emma was no longer just an observer. She had become the final link holding life together for everyone below. The signal traced to the 3rd floor control room. Marco crouched beneath a ceiling vent, removing the grill while Emma watched the hallway, every muscle ready for the unseen. The room was cramped, crowded with wires and light panels, the perfect blind spot near the stage. Marco reached deep into the duct and pulled out a small object wrapped in black tape. Not a bomb, a listening device. Emma's breath caught. Marco cursed under his breath, handed it to her. The microphone was still warm, placed less than an hour ago. Emma bent closer. It was still on, still recording. She plugged her phone into a signal converter, replaying the feed through her earpiece. 12 seconds of footsteps and laughter from the hall. Then a man's voice, the silver-haired one she'd seen with Alex. "Are you certain? If Petrov speaks, everything will spiral." Then Alex's voice, cold, measured. "I just need 10 minutes. When the lights turn green, no one will suspect a thing. I'll be gone before it blows." He paused, then added, almost casually, "Nate won't know until it's too late." Emma looked up at Marco. Their eyes met. No words were needed. They had proof. No more doubts. Alex wasn't just betraying Nate, he was planning to kill him. If they didn't act now, everything would end here. Marco grabbed his phone, calling headquarters. Code 377. Lock target Alex Vaughn. But before the line connected, the call cut off. Dead signal. Channel jammed. Emma stepped back, pulse racing. She grabbed the handheld transmitter, trying to reach the backup frequency. Nothing but static. The entire 3rd floor was jammed. Someone had activated a signal block. Alex knew they'd find the bug. He was already one step ahead. Marco's hand gripped her shoulder, his tone sharp but steady. "Go. 2nd floor. Find Nate. I'll reroute from the stage side." Emma nodded and ran. She wove through the crowd, avoiding the laughing guests. Each step felt like crossing thin ice. She spotted Nate near the hallway exit, shaking hands with a senator. Just as she approached, the chandelier above the stage flickered once the lights shifted to a soft blue hue. Emma froze. The signal, 10 minutes had begun. Nate turned, reading her face before she spoke. "I have the recording," she whispered. "It's him, Alex. He's triggering it when Petrov speaks. He said your name." Nate said nothing. He pulled out his phone, tried Marco's line. "Dead. The device is above the stage." She pressed on. He planned it perfectly. He's down there now, by the control deck. Nate nodded once, his eyes fixed on the crowd. Petrov stepped onto the stage, raising a hand to greet the audience, smiling as the spotlights flared white. And there, behind the glow, Nate saw him, Alex, standing at the lighting console, one hand on the tablet that controlled the entire system. Nate didn't hesitate. He turned to Emma. Go out the back. Don't stop. Find Marco. Give him the recording. Emma didn't move. I'm going with you. Nate shook his head. Not this time. If I fail, you'll be the only one left who knows the truth. Emma stared at him for a heartbeat. There was no fear in her eyes now, only something like regret. She nodded, turned, and walked away without looking back. Behind her, Nate moved toward the stage, through the flood of laughter and champagne light. Every step measured against the storm rising inside him. He passed through the crowd as though everything was still under control, his eyes never leaving Alex. Petrov's speech echoed through the speaker's words of friendship, partnership, promise, while somewhere beneath the applause, the countdown ticked on. Nate stopped at the edge of the technical hallway, a staff-only corridor. He pressed his earpiece. A faint crackle. Then Marco's voice. I'm at the side stage. Connection re-established. Got the file. Orders. Nate's tone was low. Don't touch him. He's mine. He approached from behind. Nice work, Nate said evenly. Alex didn't flinch. He turned slowly, almost smiling, as if he'd been waiting for this moment. You're late. Nate, one more minute, and Petrov won't be a problem, and I'll be gone like I never existed. Nate's eyes stayed locked on his. You're wrong. You were never invisible. You were just my shadow. And now the shadow's moving the wrong way. Alex smirked. You really think you can build an empire without blood? You're living a lie. I'm just cutting out the rot you were too sentimental to face. Nate said nothing. His hand brushed the button sewn inside his jacket lapel. The entire conversation was being streamed to his private server. Emma had set up the backup before she left. One signal, and it would broadcast to every party involved. Alex's stance shifted. Wary now. What do you want to arrest me? Kill me here. In front of hundreds of witnesses, Nate stepped closer. No. I want you to walk out there yourself. Go to Petrov. Tell him everything, who planned this. Who paid for it. How you sold me out to the Russians for a seat across the ocean. Alex laughed. Sharp and cold. You're insane. You think I'd do that? Nate didn't blink. If you don't, I will. And not just here. I've got your voice on record. Your transactions. Every encrypted call. If anything happens to me, it all goes public to the FBI. To Petrov. To the board. You won't last a week. Silence fell. Alex stood motionless, then slowly lowered his eyes. He knew Nate wasn't bluffing. He understood how Nate built his empire not through fear or brutality, but through precision and absolute control. Every move had an exit. Every word had proof waiting behind it. Alex looked up, voice lower now. If I confess, will you spare me? Nate shook his head. I'm not merciful, but I'll give you a choice. End it yourself. Keep what's left of your dignity, or let me hand you over as a pawn to be sacrificed. 10 minutes later, under the chandelier's glow, as Petrov finished his speech and raised his glass for a toast, Alex stepped onto the stage. His face was pale, his voice trembling but clear. To the shock of everyone present, he confessed to the assassination plot, to conspiring with rival interests to fracture the organization from within. No one spoke. No one believed their ears. Petrov froze, glass still in hand, eyes darkening. From across the hall, Nate watched in silence. Marco moved beside him and asked quietly, "What do we do with him?" Nate's reply was almost a whisper. "Nothing. He's no longer dangerous. He's a warning. And sometimes, a warning is worth more than any death." From the second-floor balcony, Emma watched the scene unfold, her heart still pounding. But for the first time, she felt something close to peace. Not because the traitor had been exposed, but because she realized she had chosen the right man to trust and the right side to stand on. 3 days after the gala, life on the surface seemed unchanged. Rasso's opened on time. Regulars ordered their usual meals. The staff smiled, the same practiced smiles. But for Emma, the storm had not yet passed. She sat in the small back office Nate had given her a quiet reward for everything she had done. On the desk lay a slim leather folder, unmarked. No sender. No address. Nate had left it there while she was gone, with a handwritten note of 4 words. You need to know. Emma opened it, her hands trembling. She didn't know exactly what waited inside, but part of her had been ready for years. The first page held an old photograph, slightly blurred, but unmistakable. Danny, her brother, standing beside a man she didn't recognize. In front of a building that looked like a training facility. Danny's face was serious, stripped of the usual reckless grin. Beneath it, a handwritten line, Undercover program. Chicago Division. 2013. She turned the pages. Surveillance log. Transcribed calls. Psychological evaluations. Each detail peeled back another layer of the truth she'd never known. Danny hadn't been just a reckless young man tangled in crime. He had been recruited by a special unit of the National Security Agency sent deep into the Yakovich network to gather intelligence on an illegal weapons route from Eastern Europe into the ULN S. He had succeeded. Secretly transmitting coded recordings through modified music files, the songs Emma had once thought he played just to pass the time. But then the mission had been exposed. Not through his mistake, but through betrayal from within. The name on the final page made her breath catch Alex Vaughn. Before becoming Nate's lieutenant, Alex had been a liaison operative feeding intel, from headquarters to shadow interests in exchange for money and power. Danny's death hadn't been a coincidence or a wrong choice. It had been execution payment for someone else's ambition. And now, the traitor had finally been dragged into the light. Emma set the folder down. She didn't cry, didn't scream. Her heart tightened, but her eyes glimmered with something fierce. Danny hadn't died quietly. He had fought and chosen the right side. She remembered the nights they'd sat together. His voice steady when he spoke of justice. A kind of doing the right thing, even when no one's watching. Now she understood. He had lived by his words. Only she had been close enough to see it. The door opened softly. Nate entered, 2 cups of coffee in hand. He placed one before her without a word, then sat across from her. They didn't need to speak much anymore. Emma slid him the final page from the file, a summary of Danny's operation. Nate glanced at it, nodded once. He was a good man, forgotten by a system that never forgives its own. I can't change what happened, but I can make sure the truth is known, at least to the one who deserves it most. Emma looked up. Her eyes no longer held the wary distance of that first meeting. Thank you, she whispered, for not letting him be buried under the label of failure. Nate tilted his head slightly, his voice quiet but certain. And thank you for not walking away when you could have. They sat in silence. No words needed. Both knew a chapter had closed and another, grounded in truth, had begun. That night, when Rasso's lights went dark and the last door clicked shut, Nate remained alone in his office upstairs, slouched in the worn leather chair, staring into the stillness beyond the glass. On his desk lay 3 open files, an untouched glass of whiskey, and a gun resting quietly in an unlocked drawer. At 38, he had lived longer than he ever expected, and paid more dearly than most who had stood between power and conscience. But tonight, he sensed another debt coming due. And this time, it might cost more than blood. A soft knock broke the silence. Emma entered, holding a new file Marco had just delivered. She placed it on the desk, then sat across from him. They didn't speak for several seconds. They had both learned when silence said enough. Nate opened the folder. A logistics report. One of his most trusted crews, the Western transport team, had moved a shipment off record. A cache of weapons had vanished from Milwaukee. No trail. No explanation. The team's leader, Ray Mendez. Nate's former bodyguard of 5 years. A man Nate had once saved from an ambush. A man who had sworn to die for him. Emma's voice was low. Ray's been missing 2 days. No contact. No signal. Maybe he switched sides. Maybe someone silenced him. Nate nodded slowly. Loyalty is a double-edged blade. When you hold it, you can build an empire. But when it snaps, it hangs you by the throat. He walked to the window, hands in his pockets, his voice quieter than usual. Do you know why I never keep anyone too close? Because the ones you trust most are the ones who cost you the most. Emma said nothing. She thought of Danny, of his faith without naivete. She understood Nate's pain. But she also knew that if he lost faith now, everything they'd fought to protect would collapse. She stepped forward, her hand resting lightly on the desk. We can't rebuild from ashes if you retreat every time someone betrays you. Not everyone turns. Not everyone walks away. If you stop trusting entirely, you'll fight alone, and you won't survive that fight. Nate was silent for a long moment. Then sighed. He turned toward her, the steel in his gaze softening into something weary. Human. He had lived too long in a world where everyone had a price, including himself. Loyalty had cost him everything: friends, family, the meaning of home. But then he thought of Emma, who owed him nothing yet stayed. Of Marco, who had followed him for over a decade without ever asking why. Of Danny, who had died believing in something larger than himself. Nate picked up the whiskey, took a slow sip, and looked at Emma with something close to faith. Get the car ready. We leave for Milwaukee at dawn. If Ray's alive, I'll talk to him. If not, I'll end it myself. Emma nodded. New questions. She knew this wasn't just about Ray. It was about whether Nate still believed in loyalty at all. Somehow, she believed he did, even if he wouldn't admit it. When she left, Nate opened the drawer, checked the gun, then slid it back. He didn't know where tomorrow would lead, but he knew one thing for certain: in a world where anyone could turn overnight, the price of loyalty was always the same blood, and sometimes the soul of the one who chose to keep the promise to the very end. Rain fell softly over Milwaukee as Nate's car pulled to a stop before an abandoned warehouse tucked behind the old industrial district on the city's north side. No sign. No guard. Just a half-closed metal door and fresh tire tracks glistening on the damp concrete. Marco stepped out first, one hand resting on the gun beneath his coat. Emma followed, her eyes scanning the perimeter. Sensing that the chill in the air came from more than weather, it was the kind of quiet tension she had learned to recognize after weeks working beside Nate. He emerged last, gaze steady, expression unreadable, as if he had prepared for this moment long before leaving Chicago. In his mind, Ray Mendez still stood as the loyal soldier who once fought shoulder to shoulder with him through endless storms. But the file Emma had unearthed told another story. Ray's name tied to a vanished shipment of weapons and a wire transfer to a bank in Panama. Every clue led back to him. And now, Nate would either hear an explanation or write the ending himself. They found Ray in a small office at the back of the warehouse, once used as a makeshift command room. He sat alone at a metal table, thinner than the last time Nate had seen him. Eyes hollow, hands lined with scars. When he looked up and saw Nate, he rose slowly. No gun, no attempt to flee. He knew this day would come. Nate said nothing. He just stared at the man he had once called brother, the man he had trusted enough to hand his life to. Why Ray didn't look away, didn't plead. He sat again, exhaled, long and low. You remember El Paso? 3 years ago. The night I nearly died trusting your contact, I lost 2 men that night. Nate came back to silence. No one took responsibility. No one asked me if I could still sleep after that. That's when I understood loyalty in your world means nothing when it stops paying. Emma stood in the corner, listening, afraid to breathe. She could hear the pain in Ray's voice, and she could see the fracture in Nate's eyes. He said nothing, just waited. Ray went on. I didn't betray you for money. I did it because I wanted to live. I needed to know that if I died, my family wouldn't starve. But I didn't sell you out. Not completely. I handed over half the shipment and kept the rest of the intel to myself. I'm not stupid. If I gave them everything, I'd have been next. Nate took a step closer, his voice deep, roughened. You could have called. You could have talked to me. You didn't have to vanish. Ray met his gaze with a faint, bitter smile, because I knew the choice you'd make. Either I'd stay and die slowly inside a machine that no longer had room for men like me, or I'd cross the line and keep what little soul I had left. I chose. You're here to finish it. So do it. I'm not running. The room went still. Marco's hand rested on his weapon but didn't draw. Emma looked at Nate, waiting for justice. Or mercy. Nate stepped forward, drew his gun. His hand didn't shake, but his vision blurred for a second. He raised it, aimed, then lowered it. Go, he said quietly. Get out of this city, and if I hear your name again in any deal, I won't come to talk twice. Ray nodded once, walked past him, never looking back. Emma watched him disappear, feeling something break and something mend in the same breath. Nate said nothing on the way out, but as he slid into the driver's seat, he glanced in the mirror, watching Ray's figure shrink until it vanished into the rain. There were men who betrayed for power, and others who walked away because they no longer believed in what they'd once served. In this world, right and wrong didn't matter as much as what part of yourself you could still hold on to when it was over. The car sped down the highway toward Chicago, rain streaking the windows, the wipers marking time in the silence between them. Marco sat in the back seat, hand over the jacket pocket, holding the folder they'd recovered from Ray's hideout inside. The names of new brokers muscling into their roots. Emma sat in the front, eyes on the wet blur outside, mind still in that warehouse, where Nate had stood between vengeance and forgiveness. She didn't know what had stayed his hand memory. Loyalty, or the recognition of himself in the man he'd almost condemned. But she knew one thing: Nate had changed. Not suddenly, not loudly, but like an underground river quietly carving a new path beneath stone. They reached Rosso's close to midnight. The restaurant was empty but still warm with light. Nate went straight to the bar, uncorked an old bourbon, and poured 2 glasses. Emma arrived moments later, still in her coat, one hand resting on the counter. He poured her a drink, sat beside her. They didn't need questions. Both knew that what hung between them wasn't explanation, it was understanding. She took a sip, eyes fixed on the darkness at the end of the bar. I didn't think you'd let Ray go. Nate stayed silent for a long time, then spoke softly. There was a time I thought strength meant never forgiving a traitor. But now I think real strength is knowing when to stop pulling the trigger. Emma turned to look at him. That wasn't something the Nate of 6 months ago would have said. The man beside her wasn't the cold strategist who commanded through silence and fear, through loss and betrayal, through every choice between death and survival. He had begun to realize that power couldn't fix every fracture. Some cracks needed people, trust, and sometimes a second chance. Nate leaned on the bar, turning the glass slowly between his fingers. He spoke of the first time he met Ray, how he'd been a quiet recruit who trusted no one. I spoke little, but was always the first to enter and the last to leave. He told her about that night in El Paso, when they'd carried a wounded man across the border under fire. Ray had saved his life that night. No one knew. Nate had never told anyone, but some debts never disappeared. Even when loyalty did. Emma listened, saying nothing. She knew that when a man like Nate began to tell stories, it meant the armor was cracking. He was letting her see the human beneath the weary, fragile part he'd hidden for years just to survive. And in that moment, she didn't see the kingpin of a power network. She saw a man quietly wondering if he'd gone too far to turn back. Nate looked up, eyes softer than she'd ever seen. "You think I'm changing?" Emma nodded slightly. "Not completely, but for the first time, you're allowing yourself to feel, not because you're weak, but because you're strong enough not to fear it." Nate gave a faint smile. Leaning back, "If someone had told me that a year ago, I'd have called them crazy. But now, maybe that's the only reason I'm still here." He refilled her glass. "This was the last time I'll ever talk to Ray, but it won't be the last time I forgive, or ask myself whether I'm still on the right path." Outside, the rain had eased. A cool wind drifted in, carrying the scent of wet wood and leftover coffee. Nate looked out the window, where streetlights shimmered over the slick pavement. He knew his life wouldn't transform overnight, but for the first time, he'd left a door open. Not for the past, for himself, and for the few he had begun to trust, not out of obligation, but choice. A week after that rain-soaked night in Milwaukee, when everything seemed to be settling, the past returned in a way Nate hadn't expected. He entered his office at Rosso's one windless morning to find Marco waiting. A sealed envelope on the desk. His expression was heavy, and even before he spoke, Nate knew whatever lay inside had kept Marco awake all night. He sat down and opened it. Inside was a printed still from a security camera nearly 2 weeks old, a man standing behind Rosso's on the night of the Petrov betrayal. The brim of a hat hid half his face. But when Nate looked closer, his heart stilled. He knew him, even after more than 10 years. He would never forget. Elias Monroe, the right hand of Nate's father, the man who had vanished after the explosion that destroyed an entire branch of the old network. A name that carried blood, guilt, and collapse everything Nate had buried deep. Elias wasn't just an old associate. He had been Nate's mentor. The man who taught him how to survive in the underworld, and the same man who had betrayed Nate's father. Leaving the ruins Nate had spent his life rebuilding. And now, somehow, Elias was back. Emma entered while Nate was still holding the photograph, his face frozen in the grip of old memories. She recognized that distant look, but did not interrupt. Marco stepped outside, leaving them alone in the stillness. After a long silence, Nate spoke, his voice low and rough, as though he had just fallen into an old storm. "He's back. Elias." Emma frowned. "Who is Elias?" Nate did not look at her. His eyes remained fixed on the photo. "He was once a legend in this world. The man every kid like me used to fear. But he's also the reason my father was killed. The organization collapsed, and I had to rebuild everything from ashes. I thought he was dead. Turns out, he was just waiting." Emma stepped closer, her gaze following the photo. "Then it's not over. The one behind Alex. Behind the blocked signals that night, it could be him." Nate nodded slowly. "If that's true, Elias isn't just returning. He wants everything back. Not the way Petrov did, not with money or weapons, but by collapsing the foundation from within." Emma asked quietly, "Do you have a plan?" Nate shook his head. "Not yet. But if Elias was smart enough to hide for 10 years, he won't strike once. He'll test me, break those who stand beside me, make me doubt myself. And once I falter, he'll strike." Both fell silent. The morning sounds of the city drifted through the half-open window. A reminder that life outside continued, regardless of what raged inside each of them. Emma placed her hand on the desk, her voice steady but resolute. "Then we move first. If Elias truly is the ghost from the past, it's time to drag him into the light." Nate looked at her, realizing for the first time he was no longer alone in this fight. Someone understood the pain he carried. Not because they had witnessed it, but because they too had lost something unnamed. That was the one thing Elias could never anticipate. Nate nodded. Yes, but this time, I'm not after revenge. I just want it to end. Emma straightened, her eyes firm with resolve. Then we'll find him, but not by playing his game. We'll make him show himself in the one way he hates most, when no one fears him anymore. In that moment, they both understood that the battle ahead was not merely for power, but for redemption, release, and the chance to finally step out of the shadow that had clung to them like a cold, wet cloak for more than a decade. The day after learning Elias was alive, Nate decided to leave Rosso's. It wasn't escape, but reflection, to step outside the steel shell he had lived in too long. He drove north, past the aging streets of Chicago that had once seen him rebuild his empire from his father's wreckage. Emma sat beside him, asking nothing for the first time. She knew some roads had to be traveled in silence, and some wounds only healed when one stopped pretending to be strong. Nate stopped by the shore of Lake Michigan, where the water stretched endlessly beneath the twilight sky. The air was cold, but he didn't feel it. For the first time in months, his mind was quiet. Emma stood beside him, hands in her pockets, eyes on the horizon. He spoke softly, without looking at her. When my father died, I thought I'd never trust anyone again. Everyone has a price. Everyone can betray. I lived that way for over 10 years, building a world where everyone stood behind glass, so if they turned away, I wouldn't feel it. Emma didn't turn. I know that feeling. When Danny died, I didn't want to open up to anyone either. I hated myself for not realizing he was fighting alone. I promised I'd never trust blindly again. But then I met you, and strangely, the closer I got, the more I wanted to believe. Not because you're perfect, but because you don't hide your flaws. Nate sighed, eyes still on the vast water. Emma, I'm not sure I deserve trust. I've done things, made choices. If you knew them all, you might not still be here. Emma turned, her voice firm. I don't need to know everything about your past. I just need to know you're trying to change. That's enough for me. A gust swept over them, carrying the scent of water and erasing the dust of what had lingered between them. Nate turned to her, and for the first time his gaze was unguarded, stripped of the walls he'd built. Then help me do something I never could before, he said quietly. Trust someone. Emma said nothing. She simply nodded. And in that brief, fragile moment, something shifted. Nate let go of a piece of his armor, and Emma stepped through the door he'd opened not by force, but through quiet, steadfast presence. They returned to Rosso's that evening with no clear plan for Elias, but with something far more important: unity. For the first time since it all began, Nate no longer acted out of revenge or control. He acted out of faith. Faith that if he fell, someone would help him rise. Faith that if Elias was the ghost of his past, then Emma was proof that the past didn't always define the future. Back in his office, Nate opened the old safe and retrieved a wooden box. Inside were documents he had kept hidden for over 10 years, Elias's real name, training files, and his former identification codes within the old network. He handed the box to Emma. You keep this. From now on, I won't do this alone. She took it without surprise. She had known this day would come, the day Nate Vaughn, who once believed control was the only way to survive, would choose another path, the path of trust. And in a world built on deceit, that might just be the first step toward something no one dared to name hope. The next morning, as the city still dozed after a light night rain, Nate sat at the long table in the hidden meeting room behind Rosso's. Before him lay a branching map of internal routes, red and black lines weaving like a spider's web. At its center, the name Elias circled in bold ink, surrounded by symbols marking the regions he once controlled. Marco leaned against the wall, arms folded. While Emma reviewed a list of names potential former allies of Elias, the air in the room was dense. Not with fear, but concentration. Nate spoke slowly. If Elias is back, he won't move alone. He'll use old loyalists, or those already doubting me, as leverage. We have to move first. But to do that, we need an ally he won't expect. Emma looked up, a spark of realization in her eyes. You mean? Andre Marco frowned, unconvinced. Andre fought you when you tried expanding internationally. He can't be trusted. Nate nodded, his tone firm. That's exactly why he's right for this. Andre knows how Elias thinks. They built the Boston branch together with my father. He withdrew later, not out of betrayal, but because he wanted out. He doesn't like me, but he hates Elias more. That's enough to start. Emma hesitated. You're sure? What if he turns again? Nate met her gaze. No longer cautious. No longer calculating every risk. We have to start trusting uncertainty if we ever want to move beyond the past. Call him. Set the meeting in neutral ground. 3 hours later. In a dim bar hidden down an alley in Boston, a place only relics of the old world remembered, Nate and Emma entered the back room, where Andre sat waiting with a drink in hand. He looked older, gray streaks in his hair, eyes slower than before. But the way he regarded Nate was the same as 10 years ago, half amused, half distrustful. He raised his glass and drawled. Well, I'm not dead yet, and today I get to see the heir of the Vaughn name. Nate sat across from him, cutting straight to the point. Elias is back. Andre froze for a second, then set his glass down. I thought he was buried under 3 layers of concrete. You sure? Nate nodded. We have photos, signals. He's testing every link, breaking the system piece by piece the same way he did to my father. Andre leaned back, eyes fixed on Nate. And what do you want my help? I'm out of this game. I don't take sides anymore. Emma spoke for the first time. We don't need you to take sides. We need you to stand in the middle. Watch. Warn us when Elias moves near your territories. Andre chuckled softly and shook his head. You think he'll let me live if he finds out I'm helping you? Nate replied, calm but cold. If you stand still, he won't let you live either. He wants to erase every trace of the old network, and you're part of it. Silence hung for a few seconds. Understood, Nate, his expression shifting for the first time. No longer mocking. You're not like your father, he said quietly. But you've got something he never did. You know when to lower your voice to survive. I'll help you, but on one condition. No one touches Boston. No weapons. No new branches. No interference with my people. Nate nodded. I don't want Boston. I only want information. By the time they left the bar, dusk had fallen. Emma walked beside Nate without speaking. But within her, something had become clearer than ever before. Nate was no longer the man who lived on control and intimidation. He was learning to negotiate, to choose allies, to accept that he could not always win, but win just enough to keep everything from falling apart. It was the clearest sign that he had begun to place his trust in the right things, at the right time, because in a silent war like this, no one survived alone. And for the first time, Nate was no longer fighting by himself. 3 days after the meeting with Andre, he returned to Chicago carrying a weight that had nothing to do with enemies outside, but with a voice rising quietly from within. During the entire drive back, he said little. Emma, sitting beside him, could sense that the silence was not born of strategy. It felt like something had been stirred awake, a memory he had locked away and thrown the key after. When the car stopped in front of Rosso's, he didn't go in. He stood on the sidewalk, eyes fixed on the worn cobblestones as if they might offer an answer to the question he had avoided his whole life. Emma came closer, asking gently, "What is it?" Nate didn't look at her. I need to go somewhere. Alone. Just for one evening. Emma didn't ask where. She simply nodded, understanding better than anyone that some battles could not be shared not because of mistrust, but because they were wars fought within. That afternoon, Nate drove west toward the edge of the city, to a weathered old house half hidden behind rows of maple trees, whose leaves were just beginning to turn. The rusty gate groaned open, revealing the two-story home standing solitary, like a misplaced fragment of memory adrift in the present. It was where he had lived with his father as a boy, before everything collapsed in one night of fire and blood. Inside, his slow steps echoed through the dusty silence. The black and white photograph of his father still hung on the wall, the glass cracked, but the eyes in it as deep as ever. Standing before it, Nate felt a strange and familiar stirring confrontation, not with his father, but with himself, with the boy who once sat behind a door listening to men talk, not realizing they were criminals, only knowing that his father was called boss by everyone, yet still sat alone in the kitchen each night with a glass in his hand. He sat down on the old wooden chair, worn smooth with time, fingers interlaced, shoulders slightly bent. He remembered the day his father was killed, when he was just 18, too young to ask why his father had chosen that path, too late to blame him, and never given the chance to forgive. Everything ended in a single explosion and a red flare of fire. For 15 years he had rebuilt, not just to survive, but to keep from being consumed by the grief he could never name. He had believed himself stronger, past it all. But now, facing Elias and the ghosts who had once walked in his father's shadow, Nate understood he was still running not from Elias, but from the part of himself that once believed power was the only shield against pain. The floorboards creaked as he rose and entered his old bedroom. The air smelled of age and memory. The small bookshelf still held a few half-read novels, and on the desk lay a tin box filled with coded notes and scraps of paper. He lifted the lid. Inside was a faded birthday card in his father's uneven handwriting, "Whatever road you take, never forget why you began." Nate gripped the card tightly, eyes burning but dry. He did not cry, because he knew that what he needed now was not regret, but forgiveness of the past, of his father, and most of all, of himself. When he stepped out of the house, twilight had deepened. He paused on the porch, watching the streetlight flicker like the heartbeat of a city that kept on living despite all its chaos. On the way back, he switched on his phone and called Emma. His voice was low, yet strangely at peace. "Tomorrow we begin. No more hiding. No more defense. If Elias wants to bring the past back, I'll meet him, but not with anger. With clarity. Because I'm no longer that boy, nor the man who built walls from pain. I'm ready to tear them down. To face it. Not just him myself." Morning in Chicago broke with a pale light slipping between the high-rises, painting a thin layer of gold over streets still damp with mist. The city stirred as always, with horns, voix, hurried footsteps. But beneath those ordinary rhythms, a quiet reckoning was forming. In this city, two men with opposite pasts and clashing beliefs were moving toward each other. One was Nate Vaughn, the man who ruled in shadow yet was learning to choose the light. The other was Elias Monroe, a ghost of the old order, fueled by hatred and the conviction that redemption was a lie. One had learned to forgive in order to continue. The other lived only to end it all. Both were stepping into their final game silent, deliberate, and deadly in every move. In a small cafe on North Street, Emma sat before her laptop. Connected to the surveillance network Marco had just finished setting up, they had traced an encrypted signal from an old warehouse in the city's south. Once a major hub for Elias's operations more than a decade earlier. The message was short, just a few symbols and the worn crest of the Vaughn family, but enough for Emma to understand that Elias was done hiding. He wanted Nate to know. He wanted the game to begin. Marco entered, holding satellite images and detailed maps. "He's not hiding. he said quietly. He's coming to end it. Right where it began. Emma nodded, her gaze sharpening. He's not just after Nate. He wants to erase the Vaughn name from this city. At that same moment, Nate stood in the private room behind Rosso's, before a wall covered in maps, photographs, and notes. But this time the wall was not a blueprint for destruction. It was open, ever fluid, filled with roots that avoided bloodshed first. Nate no longer sought victory in the old way. He wanted to preserve what he had built, to spare the city another massacre. Yet he also knew Elias would not stop unless he was stopped. The coming war was no longer between two crime lords, but between two visions of what could follow the darkness. That evening, high above Michigan Avenue's river of lights, Elias stood at a window, a glass of whiskey in hand, eyes fixed on the city he had once called his stage. He was older now, but the chill in his gaze had not faded. A man approached and handed him a phone. The message contained only 5 words: "I will not run anymore." Elias smiled faintly, took a slow sip, and murmured, "Good. I hate runners. Let's see if the son of Vaughn still bleeds like his father." In a city that refused to stop living, 2 men, unlike any others, were walking paths that seemed destined to cross at a point not far ahead. One sought to end it in blood. The other sought to end it in hope. And between them stood those who had begun to believe there might be another way to live, to exist without denying the past. None of them were perfect. None of them were innocent. And perhaps because of that, this final confrontation was no longer between good and evil, but between what once was and what could still be. Chicago, ever the silent witness. He would watch one last time, as 2 men, unlike any others, clashed, and the city itself would decide who would be the one to write the next hidden chapter of its history. 2 days after the message was sent, Rosso's became the quiet center of a storm. Nate knew Elias would not answer in words, but in action. The first came in the form of a name on Marco's latest report: Joseph Tarrant, a seemingly harmless investor who had just funneled a large sum into a small transport company on the east side, one that happened to connect directly to one of the old Vaughn smuggling routes. The company name was fake. The man behind it was Elias. The frightening truth was not that Elias had returned, but that he had never left. He had simply lain still, watching, waiting for the day Nate would open the door for him. Nate realized he had revealed too much since he began to change. He wanted to be softer, more human. But Elias did not. To Elias, trust was a weakness, and forgiveness a flaw. Now he was using the very things that made Nate human to push him toward the edge. Emma sat across from him in the office, a printed map of new transport lines between them. After a long pause, she said, "There's something you should know. Andre disappeared this morning. No contact. No show at the meeting. And all his men have pulled out of Boston." Nate clenched his fists, but did not erupt in anger, not like before. He closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them, sharp once more. "Elias doesn't want a direct fight," he said quietly. "He wants to peel everyone away from me, one by one. He doesn't need to fire a single bullet. He just has to make me stop believing in anyone." Marco entered then, handing over a thin printout from the internal surveillance feed, a leaked audio file from a call between Elias and an unidentified man. Elias spoke little, but one line cut through Nate like a blade: "Vaughn will never touch me. He's too busy trying to save people who don't want to be saved." The words sliced through every assumption Nate had left. Elias wasn't merely playing strategy. He was orchestrating emotion, pulling at Nate's strings like a patient puppeteer. Worse, he wanted Nate to destroy himself from the inside out. That night, as Emma stepped out to check the security systems behind Rosso's, her phone buzzed with an anonymous message. Only one line too late. "Emma, Danny didn't die for nothing, but Vaughn still can." She stood frozen for several seconds, her heart pounding, though her gaze remained steady. She knew Elias was aiming for her now. because she was the last link Nate still trusted. She turned back to the office, placed the phone on Nate's desk without a word. He picked it up, read the message, and his eyes stopped at the name Danny, the one name Elias had no right to speak. Nate drew a long breath. His throat had not felt this dry in years. When he looked up again, his voice had lost its calmness and turned sharp as steel. He just crossed the line. Emma asked softly. "What will you do?" Nate answered. "I want to meet him. No intermediaries. No ambushes. A real meeting. If he thinks he can touch our memories, then he needs to understand how we learned to survive them. If this is the game he built, I'll play it, but by my rules." Emma saw the light return to his eyes, not the reckless fury of old, but the clear focus of a man who finally understood himself and what he was protecting. The meeting would happen. Though none of them knew it would become the turning point that would alter not only Nate and Elias's fates, but the entire order they had lived by. The encounter was set for a Friday evening in an abandoned train depot on the southern edge of Chicago. Once a key hub for illicit shipments in his father's time, it was not a trap, not a killing ground. It was a stage, and Elias had already built the set, waiting for Nate to step into the light. Nate came alone, no Marco, no Emma, no tailored suit or mask of authority. He walked in wearing a plain black coat, unarmed, eyes open, heart steady like a man returning to the site of his own creation. But this time he hadn't come for revenge. He had come for closure. Elias stood beneath the fractured glow of a flickering neon lamp, his aged face still sharp as a blade. He smiled faintly when Nate approached and said, "Not surprised you survived, but I'll admit, you've come farther than I expected." Nate stopped a few steps away, not answering right away. He looked around the depot, remembering the nights he sat in the back of his father's car, listening to laughter, to negotiations, to gunfire in the distance. He was never allowed to ask about his voice, when it came, was calm and deliberate. "I didn't come here to relive the past. Elias, I came to tell you that you don't control this game anymore." Elias arched an eyebrow, smirking. "Game. You think what you're holding is a game. You're sitting on a pile of rotting legacy. A group of men loyal only to what you can give them. I don't want everything, just what was mine." Nate replied, "You never created anything. You only take. And now you think fear can rule the world. But you've forgotten one thing I'm not. That 18-year-old kid who inherited his father's sins. I'm not the man who ran from pain or used power to hide fear. I've stood still, looked at everything that haunted me, and decided it no longer defines me." Elias fell silent, eyes dimming for a moment before he asked quietly, "So you've chosen forgiveness, for the traitors, for the wounds that never healed?" Nate nodded. "Forgiveness isn't weakness. It's freedom from hate. From you." Elias gave a small laugh, but there was something almost sorrowful in his gaze. He took one step closer, lowering his voice. "And what do you think keeps you standing when everything else collapses? Your nobility, or a woman named Emma?" Nate didn't flinch, but his eyes cut like a blade. "What keeps me standing is knowing that the worst thing isn't losing everything. It's living your whole life without knowing who you are. And now I do. I'm the man who's been wrong, who's bled, but who still chooses to rebuild, to trust, to change. You, Elias, you're still the same ghost, proud of the ashes you made." Wind hissed through the cracked doors, carrying the chill and dust of time. Elias stood motionless for several seconds, then turned away without another word, vanishing into the darkness, the way he had vanished from so many lives before. Nate didn't follow. He stood still, letting the silence swallow everything. The wind's whistle closing the final chapter of an old life. As he stepped out of the depot, rain began to fall soft, cleansing. The drops no longer felt cold. For the first time in years, Nate knew he was no longer hunted by the past. He didn't need to run, to hide, or to wear a mask. In a city that had once been a maze of his own wrong turns, he had found the way out, not through victory, but through facing it all, stopping, and choosing the road no one thought he would take. Nate Vaughn was no longer the fugitive. He was the survivor, and, more than that, a man who had finally chosen himself. When Nate returned to Rosso's the next morning, he climbed the steps slowly, each one carrying the weight of memory. The restaurant was no longer merely a business front, but a silent witness to the many transformations of his life. Marco was making coffee, and Emma sat by the window where the morning light touched her hair, casting a calm so gentle it almost felt unreal. When their eyes met, no words were needed. They both knew it was over, not with gunfire, not with blood, but with a conversation between two people who had once believed that only darkness could keep them safe. Nate sat down, accepted the cup from Marco, and glanced toward the corner where the wall map once crowded with red ink and notes now showed only a few fading lines. The plans for revenge, the hidden links, the traces of an old world were dissolving into the present. He spoke quietly. Things will never be the same. Emma smiled faintly. No, she said. Not the same, but for the first time. Truly new. A few days later, a handwritten letter arrived at Rosso's with no sender's name. No address. Just a few deliberate words in an elegant hand. You were right. Vaughn. But being right doesn't always mean winning. He won't return. But I'll still be watching. It was all from Elias. No promises. No apologies. Just a silent admission that the war had ended. Nate folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. He no longer locked. He knew some ghosts would always exist. But if one chose not to fear them, they lost their power to rule a life. 1 week later, Rosso's hosted a small gathering to celebrate the reopening of its old wine cellar, once a secret meeting room, now transformed into an art space, where Emma displayed photographs taken by those who had lived in the shadows. She said it was a way to tell the stories no one had ever heard. For the first time, Nate invited people from outside the underworld to attend. It was no longer a game between crime lords. It was a bridge between human beings. Near the end of the evening, after the guests had gone, Emma handed Nate a worn piece of paper. It was the note Danny had written before leaving the organization. If the day ever comes when you no longer have to run, meet me where it all began. Nate held the paper, eyes heavy with an emotion too deep for words. Standing in the empty room, he closed his eyes for a long moment. It was a promise unfulfilled, but in some quiet way, he had kept it, not through action, but through the life he had chosen to live, the forgiveness he had learned to give, and the courage to stop running. The story of Nate Vaughn was never just a journey between darkness and light. It was proof that sometimes the bravest act is not defeating the enemy, but facing oneself to accept the past without allowing it to bind the future. To understand that trust, however fragile, can be reborn in the very place it once was broken. And that forgiveness does not mean forgetting, it means refusing to let old wounds build a home inside the heart forever. Thank you for listening to this story. If you see a reflection of yourself in Nate's journey, if you have ever run from who you are or searched for a way out of the dark, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Did this story make you reflect on life, on how we face our past, our mistakes, and the people who once hurt us? I would be deeply grateful to read your words, because perhaps someone else will find themselves in them too. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share the YouTube channel Underworld Love Stories to hear more moving stories every day. We'll return with others, some dark, some raw, but always carrying a spark of light about the human heart, about love, and about forgiveness. Wishing all of you watching this video good health, joy, and serenity each day. Farewell, and see you in the next story.